The morning sun painted the sky in soft amber tones as Madeline Kerrigan stepped into the polished marble lobby of Core Solutions. At 47, Madeline had been with the firm for almost a decade, long enough to see two CEOs rise and fall, long enough to stitch herself into the very DNA of the organization. Her job wasn't glamorous, she didn't command the spotlight in board meetings or show up in glossy press releases. But she was the reason deals got finalized without loopholes and contracts stood solid under pressure. She was the legal scaffolding no one noticed, until it was gone. Today, she wore a deep navy suit and her grandmother's gold brooch, something she often reached for when she needed courage. She had sensed the winds shifting the past few months. Whispers behind half-closed doors. New hires with titles that didn't quite make sense. And of course, the retirement of Thomas Caldwell, the founder and longtime CEO of the company, who had always treated her with an unusual level of respect. Madeline had barely sat down at her desk when her phone buzzed with a terse message from Evelyn, the new CEO's assistant. "Mr. Darnell would like to see you in his office. Now." No pleasantries. No context. Madeline didn't rush. She smoothed the creases of her slacks, grabbed her legal pad and pen, and made her way up to the top floor, the executive suite. She had only spoken to Grayson Darnell once since he took over. He was 32, freshly appointed by the board after Thomas's abrupt departure, and practically dripped entitlement. Word around the company was that he'd bulldozed his way through a few startups, had an MBA from somewhere expensive, and viewed seniority as synonymous with liability. The door to the office was open. She stepped in to find Grayson standing beside his desk, not even offering her a seat. His blazer was tossed on a chair, his sleeves rolled up as if that proved he was already getting things done. "Madeline," he said curtly. "Let's get to it." She didn't flinch. "Of course. We're restructuring," he began, with an overpracticed tone. "Bringing in more agile, digitally minded legal consultants who can better align with our new strategy." She waited. "You've been with the company a long time," he added, "but frankly, it's time for leaner systems. We're cutting outdated roles." "Outdated," she echoed, eyebrows rising slightly. "Yes. And with all due respect, you've been handling things in a traditional way. What we need now is someone who understands predictive contract automation and AI parsed clauses. Your services are no longer required." Madeline blinked once, then slowly set her legal pad on the edge of his desk. "I see." Grayson clearly expected more, anger, pleading, maybe even tears. Instead, she stood calmly, hands folded. "We'll provide the standard severance," he continued, trying to regain control of the conversation. "HR will handle the paperwork, and I've arranged for someone from facilities to help you with your things." "Very thoughtful," she said dryly, offering a half smile. "Any questions?" "Just one," she replied, locking eyes with him. "You've reviewed my employment contract, I presume?" Grayson tilted his head, unsure whether to bluff. "My legal team is handling all contracts." "Of course," she said smoothly. "Then I assume they've noted Section 12, subsection B. The clause outlining the terms of termination without cause. Including the severance multiplier. And the equity vesting clause." Grayson opened his mouth, closed it, then muttered something about reviewing it later. Madeline gave a small nod. "Then I'll leave you to it." She walked out of his office with her head high, passing confused stares and tight-lipped nods from colleagues who had clearly overheard the exchange. Some looked shocked. Others just sad. But none knew what she did. When she returned to her office, she calmly unlocked the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet and retrieved the original signed copy of her employment agreement. She had fought tooth and nail for that contract 3 years ago, during a time when a merger had threatened her role. Thomas had personally insisted on its generous protections, calling her the keystone of this entire operation. It included a severance package that would make most executives blush, 2 years' salary, full benefits, immediate vesting of stock options, and, most importantly, a clause that allowed her to consult for competitors without restriction, should she be terminated without cause. Grayson had walked into a trap of his own making. She slipped the document into her leather satchel and sent a message to her attorney. "Need to talk. Terminated today. Trigger clause active. Full doc attached." She took one last look around her office, photos of her with past colleagues, a signed thank you card from a grateful client whose contract she had once saved from near disaster, the small pot of lavender on her windowsill, and then she walked out, each step echoing purpose. Outside, The late morning sun was brighter than she remembered. She slid into her car, started the engine, and let out a slow breath. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even rattled. She was ready. Her phone buzzed. Leonard, confirmed. Let's talk. Opportunity here. Call me. Madeline smiled. The door Grayson had slammed shut behind her had just cracked open a bigger one. It had been less than 24 hours since Madeline Kerrigan walked out of the Vontacore building for what most assumed would be the final time. But in her world, exits didn't mean endings. They meant leverage. Power shifted in silence, and right now, it was quietly tilting in her favor. The next morning, she arrived at the downtown office of Whitmore & Klein, her legal counsel for the past 6 years. The reception area smelled like leather-bound contracts and ambition, and Leonard Klein greeted her with a warm handshake and an arched brow that said, "Let's make this count." They settled into the glass-walled conference room overlooking the Tulsa skyline, and Leonard slid a thick folder toward her. "I reviewed your agreement last night," he said. "Bradley Darnell has stepped in a mess so deep, I'm not sure even his father's shadow could pull him out." Madeline smirked. "I thought so. The trigger clause is airtight. Terminated without cause? You're entitled to 2 years of full salary, all unvested equity immediately granted, a $200,000 bonus for breach of transition protocol, and, here's the part that's going to bite him hardest, complete exemption from your non-compete." She leaned back, letting the facts sink in like the first sip of morning coffee. "I want to proceed carefully," she said. "No legal firestorm unless it's necessary. But I won't let them get away with that stunt." Leonard nodded. "We'll begin with a formal notification of contract breach. But I think we can do better than just cashing the golden parachute." "Oh?" she asked, curious. He laced his fingers together. "There's a meeting on Friday. Executive level with Helix Core Technologies. They're expanding their legal operations and are specifically looking for someone with contract innovation experience, someone who's navigated a company through merger risks, vendor disputes, compliance nightmares. Your name came up yesterday, even before the news broke." "Helix Core?" she repeated. "They're expanding into biodefense logistics, right? And data compliance," Leonard added. "Which, I believe, you're fluent in, thanks to the GovLink transition you oversaw last year." Madeline nodded slowly. "I built that policy from scratch." I told them that. For the next 2 hours, they strategized. Madeline wasn't just going to land softly, she was going to ascend. Her reputation was untarnished, and word of Grayson's hasty decision had already begun to ripple through the close-knit corporate law community in Tulsa. Some saw it as expected hubris from a neophyte executive. Others whispered about how badly it could backfire. By Wednesday afternoon, Leonard had drafted and delivered a formal letter to Vontacore's legal department, outlining the company's breach of contract and listing the precise dollar amounts owed under her agreement. She didn't inflate or bluff, she didn't need to. The numbers alone were enough to make even seasoned CFOs flinch. She knew the email would eventually land on Grayson's desk. Sure enough, that evening, her phone buzzed. The caller ID read, "Vontacore HQ, direct line." She let it ring twice before answering. "Madeline," came Grayson's voice, lacking its usual bravado. "I received your letter. Good evening, Mr. Darnell. I think there's been a miscommunication," he continued. "I was under the impression your contract didn't have certain clauses. HR didn't flag them. Perhaps because they didn't read it," she replied coolly. "But I assure you, it's all in there. With appropriate signatures. Including your father's." He was quiet for a beat too long. "I'd like to resolve this amicably," he finally said. "The press doesn't need to know about internal matters." "Oh, I agree," she said, twirling a pen between her fingers. "But the issue isn't the press. It's the law. And the contract. And the fact that you terminated a senior legal executive without understanding the cost. Is there a number that would satisfy you?" he asked. She smiled. There it was, the panic disguised as diplomacy. "I'll forward you the document with the exact figures your company is obligated to pay. No more. No less. As per the contract you tried to ignore." Before he could respond, she added, "And Grayson? I'm already in talks with Helix Core. If they ask about my time at Vontacore, I'll stick to the truth. After all, it's a compelling case study on leadership failure." Click. She hung up without waiting for a response. The next day, Leonard confirmed that Vontacore's board had been briefed. Grayson had tried to justify his decision as strategic reallocation, but their legal department warned him that the payout clause was not only enforceable but potentially subject to penalty interest if delayed. More importantly, the board was displeased that one of their most reliable contract architects had been thrown out with such disregard. By Friday morning, Madeline walked into the Helix Core meeting in a deep plum dress and a silver bracelet shaped like a quill pen, subtle armor for a woman who made her mark with precision, not volume. The panel included the CTO, the head of legal operations, and one of the senior VPs. She didn't oversell herself. She let her portfolio speak, the 10-year timeline of bulletproof contracts, the 3 vendor crises she had personally diffused, the merger compliance structure that had set a new standard for internal audits. "I'm not flashy," she concluded, "but I build foundations that don't crack." After a brief pause, the VP leaned forward. "Madeline, we're not looking for flashy. We're looking for fortress-level strategy. And frankly, we're tired of losing people like you to companies that don't know what they're doing." She was offered the role on the spot, Senior Director of Contract Strategy, with oversight over 3 regional teams and a seat at the table for quarterly leadership meetings. The compensation package rivaled what she would have made at Vantacore plus the payout she was still legally owed. When she walked out of the Helix Core building, the breeze felt like a promise. She called Leonard. "They offered," she said simply. He chuckled. "I hope you asked for the executive relocation allowance." "I did. And an innovation budget. That's my girl." That weekend, while Tulsa's business journals buzzed about quiet exits and legal missteps at legacy firms, Madeline Kerrigan sat on her back porch, sipping iced tea and drafting her first internal memo for Helix Core. Its title? "When Contracts Are More Than Just Paper." She was done being invisible. Now, she would write the rules, and everyone would be forced to read them. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds as Madeline sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and her employment agreement in the other. The elegant legalese stared back at her like an old friend, each clause carefully crafted, each provision a safeguard placed long before she ever imagined needing it. She had always believed in preparation. It was why she'd worked late nights, rechecked the sub-clauses in supplier contracts, and insisted on revising boilerplate documents until every word felt like armor. Now, that preparation had become her parachute. The clause in question was on page 12, buried, quiet, but immensely powerful. It was the early termination trigger. If she was dismissed without cause, the company owed her not only a full year's salary, but accelerated stock options, full benefits coverage for 12 months, and, this was the kicker, a complete waiver of her non-compete clause. Grayson hadn't read it. She was certain. Across town, Grayson Darnell stormed into his father's former office with the kind of confidence only inherited power could grant. The second he fired Madeline, he felt triumphant. This was his era, and she was just another relic of the old regime. He didn't see her as a threat, just paperwork with a face. But by the time his assistant forwarded him a message from the legal department marked urgent, termination risk assessment, that confidence began to crack. Did she really have a golden parachute clause? He barked into the phone, pacing. "Yes," said Veronica, Vantacore's head of HR, sounding more strained than usual. "And not just that, there's no non-compete in the event of a no-cause termination. You didn't terminate her for cause, Grayson. We don't need a reason to restructure. You do when the restructuring involves someone with a clause like hers," she snapped. "Especially someone who has access to all of our supplier data, long-term contract strategy, and compliance risk mitigation protocols." Grayson paused. He had assumed Madeline would just slink away. Maybe blog about ageism or write a memoir no one would read. But she wasn't gone. She was waiting. Meanwhile, at a cafe in Midtown, Madeline sat across from Leonard Phelps, CEO of Helix Core, the very company Grayson's father had once considered a major rival. Leonard stirred his tea with a kind of unhurried calm that made powerful men seem invincible. "So he fired you?" he asked, eyebrow raised. "Effective immediately," Madeline replied, her tone flat. Didn't even look up from his laptop. Leonard chuckled softly. "And your clause? Active. Triggered. Enforceable." He leaned back in his chair. "Well, that's poetic." Madeline gave a half smile. "He thinks I'm a paperweight. But I was the one making sure the whole table didn't collapse." Leonard slid a leather folder across the table. "Then let me give you a stronger table." Inside was a proposal, Director of Contract Governance and Compliance at Helix Core. A generous salary, plus bonuses, plus stock. But more than that, it came with a seat at the executive strategy table, and the freedom to shape the department from scratch. You always said your dream was to build something that would outlast you, Leonard added. Madeline flipped through the folder, absorbing the numbers, the structure, the terms. This is a serious offer. So is your experience. Grayson may not see it, but the rest of the industry does. Later that night, Madeline stood at her window watching the city lights flicker. Part of her wanted to feel rage. Or vindication. But what she felt was alignment. The kind of quiet certainty that comes when every preparation you've ever made begins to pay off. She emailed her acceptance letter to Helix Core's HR director before midnight. The next morning, a storm broke loose at Vonticore. Charles Darnell had returned early from his retirement tour, his surprise visit shaking the foundations of the corporate tower. People whispered about his fury in the elevator banks, about the private meeting he'd called with Brad, and about the fact that Madeline's office remained untouched. Inside the boardroom, Charles didn't mince words. "You fired one of the few people who understood the language of this business," he said, voice low and lethal. "And now you've exposed us to financial risk, reputational fallout, and possibly legal action." Grayson folded his arms. "She wasn't aligned with my vision." "She was the vision," Charles barked. "She built the risk frameworks you're now so eager to dismantle." Veronica entered with a folder, looking like she'd aged 10 years. "We've confirmed her termination package. The severance is due immediately. Legal estimates the buyout, bonuses, and benefits will cost us nearly $1.2 million, plus whatever competitor she joins." Grayson's face paled. "We're negotiating that, right? She's already signed with Helix Core." The silence that followed was deafening. At Helix Core, Madeline's first week was anything but slow. She'd hit the ground running, retooling outdated agreements, flagging clauses vulnerable to exploitation, and mentoring 2 junior associates in the finer points of corporate legal maneuvering. On Thursday, Leonard walked into her office holding a printout. This just dropped. It was an industry newsletter. On the front page, Vonticore exec ousted. Legal architect joins Helix Core. Madeline's name was in bold, followed by a glowing summary of her career achievements and the now viral quote from her last compliance summit. "Power isn't loud, it's legal." She read the headline and sipped her coffee. "I thought it might get some attention." Leonard grinned. "Vonticore's phones are probably melting." Indeed, by Friday morning, Dana from Vonticore's board reached out, cordially, carefully, asking for a meeting. Not with Grayson. With her. Madeline raised an eyebrow at the message. "They're scrambling," Leonard said when she mentioned it. "Let them," she replied. Because Grayson hadn't just fired a department head. He'd activated a clause he didn't understand. And that mistake was about to teach him just how expensive it could be to underestimate someone who wrote the rules. Monday morning dawned cool and clear, but the atmosphere at Vonticore headquarters was anything but. Madeline stood outside the revolving glass doors, her reflection staring back at her, confident, composed, and completely in control. She adjusted her navy blue blazer and walked in. She wasn't here for a return, or for revenge. She was here because the board had requested her presence. Because they now understood what Grayson Darnell had failed to. Power doesn't always come with a title, it often comes with the knowledge of what makes a company run, and the leverage to protect it. The receptionist stood as she approached. "Miss Quinn. They're waiting for you upstairs." "Thank you, Alicia," Madeline said, smiling faintly. The young woman had interned with HR during Madeline's tenure and clearly remembered her, not just as an executive, but as a mentor who had once helped her rewrite her internship contract to include paid transportation stipends. In the executive conference room, 11 board members sat in pinstripe suits and curated discomfort. The air was thick with tension, and Grayson Darnell sat at the far end of the table, noticeably paler than usual, a folder clutched like a shield in front of him. "Madeline," said Dana Crawford, chair of the board, rising to greet her. "Thank you for coming." Madeline nodded. "I assume this meeting is about the termination package?" "In part," Dana said carefully. "But more broadly, about where this company is headed, and the risks we've recently uncovered." Madeline took the open seat opposite Grayson and laid her own folder on the table, deliberately not opening it. "I'm listening." Dana continued. "First, allow me to apologize for the way your departure was handled. The board was not consulted. We only became aware of your contract terms after HR flagged the severance trigger, after it had already been activated. She glanced meaningfully at Grayson, whose expression tightened. "And now you're facing a 7-figure payout," Madeline said calmly. "As outlined in the agreement I signed with Charles 3 years ago. An agreement that was included in my personnel file, which your current CEO had full access to." There was a pause. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I didn't think it applied anymore," Grayson muttered. "Didn't read it, you mean," Madeline replied coolly. "Which is ironic, considering you dismissed me for being outdated." A few board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Dana didn't smile, but there was something close to admiration in her eyes. "Let's talk about options," Dana said, redirecting. "You're within your rights to collect the severance and move on. But we'd like to propose an alternate arrangement." Madeline folded her hands. "Go on." "You would serve as an independent consultant for the next 6 months, paid at the rate outlined in your contract, but with an active role in stabilizing our client relationships, rebuilding confidence in the legal team, and overseeing a risk audit on all vendor contracts signed in the last year." Grayson sat up straighter. "You want her back? After all this?" Dana turned to him, her voice frost-edged. "We want her guidance. Something you clearly failed to value." Madeline considered the offer. It was tempting. Part of her would enjoy re-entering the building not as a terminated employee, but as a strategic authority. But another part of her hesitated. She had just started her new role at Helix Core, an environment where she was respected from day one. Why wade back into a mess created by someone else's arrogance? Still, she'd never shied away from difficult rooms. Especially not ones she had every right to dominate. "If I accept," Madeline said slowly, "I want full autonomy in how I manage the audit. I report directly to the board, not to Mr. Darnell. I want acknowledgement in the quarterly report about the breach of protocol in my termination, and I want the confidentiality clause in my severance waived." Dana raised an eyebrow. "Why the last one?" "So I can speak freely at the upcoming legal ethics panel at the State Bar Conference," Madeline replied. "Nothing defamatory, of course. But my experience is instructive." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then, Dana nodded. "Those terms are acceptable." "Absolutely not," Grayson snapped. "This undermines my leadership." "You did that yourself," Madeline replied, her tone razor sharp. "You fired someone without reviewing the consequences. And let's be honest, you didn't fire me because of performance. You fired me because I reminded you that leadership isn't about ego, it's about responsibility." "You're the past," he said, voice rising. "I'm the future." "Then learn how to read," Madeline said. Dana turned to the board. "All those in favor of proceeding with the consulting arrangement as proposed?" Hands went up, one after another. Grayson stayed down. It didn't matter. When the motion passed, Dana stood. "We'll have the legal team draw up a new agreement." "Thank you, Madeline. I'll review it within 24 hours, she said. "Assuming there are no surprises." As the meeting broke up, Grayson brushed past her on the way to the door. "You think you've won?" She looked him in the eye. "Winning wasn't the goal. But I do think you've learned something. That's enough." Back at Helix Core later that day, Leonard greeted her with a raised eyebrow as she walked in. "You went?" "I did. And? They offered me the consulting contract. Same compensation. Plus quarterly attribution for my work and a seat at their compliance table." He whistled. "Did you accept?" "I told them I'd think about it. I don't need the job. But maybe the company still needs someone to teach them how not to implode." Leonard chuckled. "Well, if they're smart, they'll take the help." Madeline smiled. "If they'd been smart, they wouldn't have fired me in the first place." She walked into her office, the sunlight casting long streaks of gold across her desk. Her inbox was full. Her calendar was packed. Her reputation was intact, stronger than ever. She hadn't just survived the termination. She had turned it into the pivot of her career. And Grayson? He was now learning, painfully, publicly, that ignorance isn't a power move. It's a liability. 3 months had passed since the now infamous boardroom reversal that had seen Madeline Quinn reclaim her power, not with fists or fury, but with facts and contracts. Her consulting agreement with Vantacore had been executed precisely to her terms, and her visibility across the industry had only grown stronger. She was no longer simply the woman who'd been wrongfully terminated, she was the strategist who played corporate chess and called checkmate with a clause. Now, she stood at the lectern of the Oklahoma State Bar's annual Legal Leadership Conference, The hotel ballroom packed with over 400 attendees, attorneys, corporate officers, journalists, even a few curious grad students. The panel was titled, Contracts, Consequences, and Career Comebacks. Madeline adjusted the mic slightly and smiled out at the crowd. There's a misconception, she began, that power in the corporate world belongs solely to those with titles and corner offices. But contracts are the true currency of trust. And trust, once betrayed, tends to have a very specific, and often expensive, price tag. Laughter rippled gently through the audience, and Madeline continued, sharing the story not by name but by narrative, how a senior legal strategist had been dismissed by a new CEO without review of her employment agreement, how the board had been left in the dark, and how a single oversight had cost a company not only 7 figures, but also its stability and public reputation. When she concluded, the standing ovation was swift. She had become more than just a cautionary tale, she was now the symbol of calculated resilience in a field often ruled by noise instead of nuance. Later that afternoon, as she stepped into her office at Helix Core, now freshly redecorated with soft leather furnishings and framed accolades, Leonard leaned against her doorway. "You're a hit," he said, holding up a copy of the Tulsa Business Digest with her face on the front page under the headline, "The Clause Queen of Corporate Law." "I told you not to let marketing choose the name," she said with a grin. "They love alliteration. Besides, your inbox is full of speaking invites. UCLA, Penn Law, even TechCrunch wants you at their next Founder Summit." Madeline leaned back in her chair. "They want to hear how not reading an employment clause can cost a company millions." "No," Leonard said. "They want to hear how you turned an insult into influence." Just then, her assistant knocked gently. "There's a Miss Dana Crawford on line 1. She says she's with Vantacor's board." Madeline picked up the call. "Dana." "Madeline," Dana replied warmly. "I just got out of a meeting with the board. As of this morning, Grayson Darnell has formally resigned. Effective immediately." Madeline paused. "Voluntarily?" Dana chuckled. "Let's just say." The pressure mounted. The board was split for a while, but after the last quarterly review, and the New York Times piece about internal instability, he was encouraged to step away. "I'm not surprised," Madeline said. "He was always chasing perception, not performance." "There's more," Dana continued. "We're restructuring the executive suite. Creating a new role, Chief Ethics and Strategy Officer. Directly under the CEO, reporting to the board." Madeline blinked, sitting up straighter. "I'm calling to offer it to you." There was silence for a beat. "I'm flattered," Madeline said, choosing her words with care. "But Helix Core's offered me something I haven't had in years: uninterrupted creative control, total alignment, and zero micromanagement." "We know," Dana said. "But this role comes with full oversight of legal, compliance, and strategic policy. It's a step beyond what you had before. You wouldn't just be fixing problems, we want you designing the company's future." "And the CEO?" "We're vetting candidates, but whoever it is, they'll know you're not to be dismissed." "Not again." Madeline swiveled in her chair, eyes drifting toward the window, where the skyline of Tulsa glowed against a late summer sun. She didn't respond right away. Instead, her thoughts turned to the last few months, the consulting contract she'd executed to perfection, the silent look on Brad Darnell's face as he was demoted to an advisory role, the employees at Vantacor who had quietly emailed her to thank her for standing up to corporate carelessness. The weight of a legacy carefully reclaimed. "I'll consider it," Madeline finally said. "But there are conditions." "Of course," Dana replied. "Send them over." Madeline smiled faintly. "You already know one of them. The transition ethics program I proposed during the consulting arrangement? It becomes permanent. Mandatory for all executives. And not just a slideshow. I want a rotating legal residency program for recent law grads, diversity forward, and fully funded." Dana exhaled into the line. "You don't think small, do you?" "I've seen what small thinking does," Madeline said. "It crashes companies." Later that evening, Madeline walked into her home, greeted by the soft glow of vintage sconces and the faint smell of roasted rosemary from the kitchen. "You're late," her partner, Michael, called from the stove, apron on and wooden spoon in hand. "Let me guess, another offer?" "Guilty," she said, kicking off her heels and walking into the kitchen. "Well?" he asked, stirring. "They offered me chief strategy. Full control. Board access. Ethics reform. It's tempting. You going to take it?" "I don't know," she said honestly. I'm in a good place. Helix Core is growing, and I'm finally mentoring again. But Vanta Core's offering real change. Michael smiled, ladling stew into bowls. Then you'll make the right call. You always do. They clinked glasses over dinner, and she let the decision sit, unmade, for now. Because for the first time in a long time, Madeline wasn't reacting to someone else's move. She was writing her own playbook. And whether she returned to Vanta Core or not, one thing was certain. No one would ever overlook her again.